Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to do a review of the ADATA GAMMIX S70. Before I go any further though, let me let you into something, okay? Come here. Now, on this channel I have reviewed a lot of SSDs. Dare I say I've reviewed a lot of things, from NAS to DAS, from routers to Thunderbolt to USB and SD cards. But when it comes down to reviewing a lot of these items, a lot of the time I look at what's interesting, what people are wondering about. But right now, I have never had so many requests to review an item like this one. Generally, when I am looking at an item I'm going to review, I'll message the brands and ask them politely, have you got a unit that I can utilise for a review? Or I'll, go off my own bat and buy it myself. But this drive, I have not had so much of a hard time in any device I've ever had to review for this channel as I've had for this one. From e-shops running out of stock to the brand themselves sending a unit and the courier effectively losing it in transit, no unit has ever caused me the hardship just to get it to the camera to show you people as this device. And because it's been requested so many times in the comments, I've felt honour bound to persevere and get hold of this. Several times I've nearly given up getting this into the studio just for a review, but finally I have it here to show you guys for today's video, and it better live up to my expectations, because right now this is the SSD to beat in terms of performance. Over the last few weeks, when I've talked about SSDs, be it in individual performance testing in the likes of AJA, Crystal Disk and more, or in PS5 SSD testing, this has been the SSD that's been living there in the background going, you wait, you wait. And up until now, the best SSD that I've ever seen in all of that testing has been the FireCuda 530. And this is the one that I've been waiting for to challenge that SSD. Its performance benchmarks, its price point, the storage capacity, the fact it has one of the coolest looking heatsinks I've seen in a while. This is the SSD that I've been pinning a lot of hopes on, and I'm really hoping today's review it gets to live up to my expectations. Now, this is the XPG SSD from ADATA, known as the GAMMIX S70. Now, they do have different SSDs in their range. This one, the S70, is their premium PCIe Gen 4x4 class M.2 NVMe SSD. Now, it arrives in a 1TB and a 2TB version, with the 1TB knocking around for about $199 and the 2TB knocking around for $399. Now, that is the RRP, when in fact you can get it quite well priced in a number of places. Indeed, over here in the UK, if you head over to amazon.co.uk, you can get it for the 1TB for about 160 nicker, which is massively cheaper than most other SSDs out there, getting even close to the performance threshold of this SSD. I'm talking about performance thresholds. This 1TB drive has a reported performance maximum with the latest firmware update. Very important. I'll talk about that more a little bit in the bench testing later on. With the sequential read there reported at a maximum 7,400 megabytes per second, noticeably higher than everyone else right now. Sequential write reported on the 1TB at 5,500 megabytes per second maximum, and then the 2TB model that unfortunately I don't have here with me today, the 2TB have got 7,450 megabytes per second sequential read, and sequential write at 6,800, again putting it in among the highest performing reported sequential read and write SSDs out there right now. Now, how the hell is this SSD able to fulfill those numbers? Well, one look at the specification sheets tells us that not only is this a PCIe Gen 4x4 SSD, and it arrives with NVMe 1.4 in its revision there of connectivity, and it takes advantage of 3D TLC NAND at 96 layer, but this SSD takes advantage of a very unique controller. I talked about the Phison for quite a while, the Phison E18, the PS5 5018 controller. This takes advantage of a much lesser used but still exponentially powerful InnoGrit. Now, again, I've not had a huge amount of personal experience with it, the IG5236, but hopefully the performance benchmarks are on screen there to show that this SSD has actually outperformed the Phison in multiple tests. So again, this brings a lot of contention into a lot of our coverage of this SSD particularly. When we look at other SSDs that we compared against in the last few weeks, that have, you know, the Gigabyte Auroras, the MSI Spatium, the Brent series, the FireCuda themselves, all of those take advantage of that Phison E18. And with WD Black and Samsung 980 Pro both having their own in-house controller, all of these different controllers that have been floating around, very few SSDs have taken advantage of the InnoGrit right now. And again, in the benchmark later on, we will be taking a good long look at that. Before we go any further, let's see what we get for our money. It's a nice shiny reflective box that does not agree with the lights here in the studio, from what we can see. If we have a look inside, what do we get? We have 0 manuals, no instructions there. The outside of the box does detail on the rear information, links to where you can go to find out more information about your warranty and setup instructions. There's a little bit more about the stuff to do with secure erase, a little bit more about the memory on the rear, talk a bit about the maximum performance of this drive, and really that's about it. It's quite shiny, it's quite a nice little neat box. I think the PC gamer community will quite like that. But the drive itself is where it gets very, very cool. As mentioned, this drive arrives with an in-house heatsink pre-applied, with all the thermal padding pre-applied straight off the bat, and it is a lovely looking thing, a very unique heatsink there, using obviously for heat dissipation, but the the kind of air coverage of the density of that heatsink is very, very unique indeed. And do you know what? We should probably get this out of this casing. Just take a much closer look at what we've got inside here. Took me a second to get a half decent screwdriver there, but here we go. We've got one screw out. Let's get that other screw out there. Have a look at that chip density. I'm quite looking forward to seeing the makeup of that InnoGrit controller inside here. Let's get that out. Slot that heatsink off the top. So again, if you can see the top part of that heatsink there, what's really interesting, and I've covered this in other videos previously, when you buy an SSD that has the heatsink pre-attached, not only do I recommend that because it's obviously applied in an air-controlled manufactured environment, but also you tend to find that thermal pads have been placed on the heatsink in far more kind of drive-specific ways to make sure that the right components get the right amount of coverage. So, for example, at the very top there, you can make up that InnoGrit controller. Then I'm going to try and get the light right, but the big chip there at the top, that is our controller. And of course, the controller is where you want to make sure the bulk of that heat dissipation via the thermal padding and into the heatsink is applied there. But the NAND, you want to keep the NAND a little warm so it keeps that data flowing there. It's the controller and the memory that you want to maintain nice temperatures on, and predominantly that modules there at the bottom, that 3D TLC NAND there, is just nicely covered but not fully covered by the thermal padding there, which I think is going to do a lot of good work to maintain the performance of this SSD. Another interesting part, if we can just make that out there on the light, if you can just see it, that the NAND is ADATA branded NAND there as well throughout this component. The base of this metal casing there of the heatsink, the drive is very firmly applied into that there. I'm not going to try and raise that. This is a single-sided SSD, but I imagine the 2TB maybe takes advantage of dual-sided NAND there throughout. Again, this is a very, very well-made heatsink here for the drive to be sitting inside. And again, there's a little more information other than the serial there on the rear. If we look at the specifications in a little bit more detail there, we can see that this drive also arrives with a durability factor there, reported in at 0.38 drive writes per day. And of course, we could look at the TBW, terabytes written, but again, that's going to scale against each of the drives. I think one's at about 700 odd, the other one's about 1400 odd. But 0.38 drive writes per day, although it's higher than the likes of the WD Black and the Samsung 980 Pro, it is still less than the 0.7 drive writes per day featured on the FireCuda 530. So although this does seem, at least on reported performance, to be higher than most of its competitors in sequential read and write, it has to be said that in terms of durability, the FireCuda 530 still seemingly commands that long-term durability and endurance in its lifespan. The drive arrives with 5 years of manufacturer's warranty there, no need for registration or anything like that, and does have a 2 million hours reported MTBF, although not a lot of us take advantage of MTBF these days. with the heatsink attached. It has a height of a full 15 mil. So again, if you are looking at this as a PS5 upgrade, and of course we're going to be running numerous tests on this drive with the PS5 SSD update in the beta form and hopefully full release soon. But again, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this SSD and heatsink inside that system and have the full panel covering the top there. We'll be doing thermo testing on that as well, just to see what the difference will be with a third-party heatsink versus their own heatsink there attached to the top. I mentioned the performance benchmarks there at the top of the video, and this drive, again, although it does have a reported maximum 7,400 megabytes per second, presumably with that latest firmware update on board, it's going to be interesting to see if my 6-core i5 system, 11th Gen i5 with 16 gig of DDR4 memory, non-GPU equipped, is going to be able to hit those benchmarks. I hope it at least reaches 7,000, but again, I think this is an SSD that, unless you're running like a 12-core Ryzen or maybe a Xeon and GPU equipped, I think it's going to be very hard to push this to that maximum. That doesn't make me doubt the numbers they're issuing, but I will highlight that to hit those numbers, you're going to need a decent enough rig to get close to those. Now, we haven't really talked about IOPS on this drive. Now, I have referred to an update that many people in the comments have highlighted, that this drive, the S70 GAMMIX, has a firmware update recently, released in mid-August, that has pushed the reported 320 over 720 IOPS up to a much higher 750,000 IOPS read-write across this drive, with the performance increases that it's done to tweak the internals of this SSD. And it is going to be very intriguing to see how our test machine deals with this, and of course the PS5 testing. But I think we've talked about this drive enough. We want to see the proof in the pudding. We want to see what this drive brings to the party. So let's get this inside our test machine and find out what it's capable of. Okay, so we've made our way onto the desktop of my test machine, and before we go any further, there's a few things to go through. Well, so first and foremost, there is Crystal Disk and there is our SSD. Now, it's worth highlighting, I've done practically no testing on this, and indeed, when the drive arrived and I unpacked it, it did have the latest firmware, 3.2.f.p7. Indeed, if we head over to the test, we go to the download pages here, we scroll to the bottom, we can see that the updater here, 3.2.9.v, we've installed it and we've double checked, and indeed we do have the current firmware updated to the latest version. Indeed, there was a lot of talk on a few online platforms talking about how the firmware update needed to be done in order to get much better performance benchmarks there. And as you can see, that is what we're running right now. We're running that benchmark there, we're running that version, and I'm pleased to say that we seemingly have the latest version of that firmware on board. On top of that, we have gone ahead and looked into a few more resources there in the background. We've got the PDF there that we're going to be comparing our results against later on, that have got the latest top figures there. And again, that was utilizing the Ryzen 7 5800X, a very powerful performance benchmarked CPU there that they utilized. And of course, we've got the drive already recognized internally. But one thing I will highlight, it is running a little hot. I kind of assumed an SSD like this when we've done zero testing right now. As you can see, it's been on for 0 hours with that firmware update, NVMe 1.4, but nothing's really been done with it. It is already on 39C, which is running a little hot for a drive on idle. I've got to say, with a lot of the drives that we've tested previously, with first-party and indeed third-party heatsinks, normally at startup pipping into the 30C. Now, going no further, let's go straight into there. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and establish connection with that drive. Going into the storage manager here. We're going to go ahead and it's going to find it. We're going to go ahead and let it be to default there. We're going to create a nice simple volume. Again, we're going to leave everything as default as well as we go through this. We're going to call this the X drive, and we're going to give it a name there. So we're just going to call it the ADATA GAMMIX S70 1TB. Sorry, I'm quite close to the microphone with the keyboard there. Giving it that name, I'm going to format it nice and quick. Normally I would do this prior to recording, but I'm going to keep this as straight and narrow as possible. There is our drive already displayed there, and indeed there are the specifications of our test machine, an 11th gen i5 11400 CPU there, and again that is a 6-core processor with 16 gig of DDR4 memory, but we aren't utilizing any kind of GPU today. It's also worth highlighting, if we head into the storage manager there, if we've still got that open, you can see that our default drive there, we are taking advantage of a 1 TB SATA SSD for our default SSD drive. This is taking advantage of an available PCIe Gen 4 expansion slot, so this isn't using it as a primary drive. That may impact results a little bit. And finally, we are utilizing OBS for our recording today. Unfortunately, that means that I'm not going to be able to display a lot of the test regimen. It's going to take about 20 to 30 minutes to run every single test. So throughout our testing, we are going to be utilizing the following software. We're going to be using, of course, Atto. I'm sorry if the screen goes black there as we open up each program because of the Windows authentication. We're going to be using Atto, 3 different tests, taking advantage of a 256 meg, 1 GB and 4 GB test file. We're also going to be taking advantage of Crystal Disk Mark, and in Crystal Disk we're going to be looking at a 1, a 4 and a 16 gig test file. On top of that, we're going to be using AS SSD, and in AS we're going to be utilizing a 1, a 3 and a 5 GB test file here on the GAMMIX S70. And finally, we will be taking advantage of AJA Disk Benchmark, which again is slightly unconventional because this is more of a sustained video editing platform here. So what we're mainly going to be looking at while going through these tests using the ADATA GAMMIX S70 is this graph at the bottom. We aren't looking at the read-write performance there at the top throughout this. So again, if I do try to show you the performance benchmarks there, you'll see that they're very irregular because of the kind of overhead of using screen recording software like OBS. I could use an external capture card, but unfortunately my capture card is already set up for PS5 testing for other videos. So what I'm going to be doing now is running through all of these tests. I'm going to leave 1 minute 60 seconds between every test to allow the SSD to cool down a little bit. I'm not going to give it too much time because I want to make sure things are kept as fair as possible. So again, 1 minute is going to be between every single test, and every single one of these bits of test software is going to be ran with 3 different test file sizes. And with that gamut of information, we're going to find out more about this drive. Although, the last thing I will highlight just before we go, and I know I touched on this earlier on, is how this controller, the InnoGrit Rainer IG5236 that's featured on this SSD, compares against that Phison that we talked about for a long time. And as you see, this is a report from CDR Labs, a pretty big name, let's be realistic, at the start of this year, comparing these SSDs. And very early doors, you can see a big difference there between these two. But of course, a lot of these specifications have come from that CPU there. Again, if we look at the benchmark for that on CPU benchmark, chances are we're going to see an enormous difference there at 28,000 there for that processor. So again, something to bear in mind when we look at our results. But for now, I'm going to go through each of these testing schemes. And for me, this is going to be another 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes. For you, it'll be mere seconds. Let's get to the results. Right, so testing has concluded, and I'll be honest, there have been some very interesting results for a multitude of reasons. As you can see there, at the end of our testing ended approximately about a minute and a half ago. And right now you can see the temperature is at 45°C there on Crystal Disk. Now, what's particularly intriguing is if we look at a graph of the temperature throughout all of our testing here, we can see that although, yes, it did run hot generally, when it was like in the mid to high 30s via utilization, the highest it ever got was 55°C. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of the testing we've ran previously, these drives can get remarkably hot. And although it started warm, it has to be said, it certainly controlled the temperature during the more intensive testing, like the Atto benchmark, which is a great deal more spread out over time, as well as the AJA testing, which is kind of a constant hitting attack of read and write activity on this disk. So again, it did run hot, but it maintained and controlled that temperature incredibly well all the way through the testing, so I did think that was worth touching on throughout the testing. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen there, we can see the performance benchmarks, and I can tell you straight away off the bat, we never hit 7,400 megabytes per second in our testing. We broke into the 7s, but we never hit 7,400. But there were some sneaky things up our sleeves. I did realise that earlier on when we did refer to the pass mark of the AMD Ryzen, a lot of the highest benchmarks came from. It's worth highlighting that the CPU we're using in today's tests, that 11th Gen i5, only ranked 1700 on CPU benchmark. Again, it is a high score, but it certainly was nowhere near as high. So although I do want to, have these benchmarks referred to on screen from XPG themselves, as well as some of the results from other sites, we have to remain relative, because during the course of these tests, we aren't using the incredibly highfalutin architecture that some of these tests have been conducted on. Very important indeed. So we will come back to this from time to time. But first and foremost, let's have a look at probably the clearest stats, and they of course come from Crystal Disk. Now, Crystal Disk, we ran those 3 tests there. Let's bring the GAMMIX down there. And as you can see, we broke into the 7,000 megabytes per second read on all 3 tests. I know these don't strictly refer to day-to-day utilization, but still nonetheless. And again, I think we've got a slight anomaly there in the mix there at the top as how it compares with the others. But certainly IOPS rankings, certainly read activity, but probably more so than anything, the write activity was particularly impressive on this drive with that newer firmware installed. Now, just to give you a little bit of perspective, I've got a Phison E18 SSD that we utilised previously in the form of the Corsair MP600 Pro. And as you can see here, this SSD on this test machine, this very test machine, only broke into at 16 gig size, 6,929 megabytes per second. Now again, this SSD is capable of hitting the 7,000, but on this machine, it wasn't capable of it. Whereas we look at the stats here for this GAMMIX S70 SSD, and not only did it break into the 7,000, but more importantly, look at that write speed. Both of these were 1 TB SSDs performed on the same system a day or two apart, and look at the performance difference between them. An enormous advantage there on that GAMMIX S70 SSD, and that was reflected throughout all of the testing. Look at the 4 gig here underneath, 7,000 versus 9.6. It just absolutely wiped the floor in every one of those test files there if we continue to look moving forward between these 2 SSDs. Again, very, very impressive figures there. And although it didn't crack higher than early 7,000 megabytes, getting very close to the 7,100, again, we're going to blame my rig more than the SSD itself for that. Now, let's have a look at Atto Disk Benchmark. So again, Atto, we can look at general performance and of course IOPS as well. We've got the 256 megabytes, so a quarter of a gig, followed by the 1 gig, followed by the 4 gig test file there. And again, lovely stats there from Atto. Of course, we're not going to see that sequential kind of easy big chewable numbers that we saw previously, so it's a little harder to rate that against that of the internal benchmark stuff. But even then, with the read comfortably hitting 6,300 megabytes per second, or 6.3 gigabytes across all 3 tests in terms of read, and in terms of write, hitting very high at 5.8 gigabytes, going into 5.9 in some cases, so nearly 6 gigabytes per second of write performance there. So again, if we go into our archive of other SSDs that we've tested recently, we can look at the Spatium here. And on the Spatium SSD, if we compare, not the IOPS, we don't want the IOPS, we'll compare against the general read-write on the Spatium here, and we look at, for example, the 256 gig the megabyte SSD and see how they compare like for like. And again, look at the difference between them. The ADATA GAMMIX S70 is massively outclassed the E18 powered MSI Spatium SSD by a comfortable margin throughout there, and that was reflected continuing throughout each of the capacity tiers. The Spatium there getting just into the 6 gig in places, but just being wiped off the map there by the ADATA. And again, all the way through there, as we compare against each tier, it was just an absolute bloodbath. Sorry, we need to look at the IOPS there. And again, in terms of IOPS, unsurprisingly, we're still seeing those stats being just first class throughout. Let's close some of these down, get a better look there. If we have a look at the IOPS, we can see again a comfortable advantage there being taken by the ADATA all the way through, and we compare against this E18 drive. And remember, a lot of this is about comparing there the InnoGrit Rainer IG5236 inside the ADATA versus the Phison E18 controller that's in so many SSDs these days. So, coming out of the AtoDisk benchmark score, we can go into AS SSD. And again, AS is a little bit more of a more subdued result, I think, on the majority of these, as we've seen before. And if we have a look against how that compares against another SSD, perhaps the Titanium Micro TH7175. So let's bring some of these stats up for read and write and compare them against them one by one. So again, let's go with the 1 GB version. So again, comparing the 1 gig versus the 1 gig, we can see that again, AS SSD benchmark on identical settings, it was just higher in every single regard, with a lower millisecond response access time there being reported. So again, between the two of them, performance was higher on the XPG, but a little bit of a quicker response on the right, but very small indeed. And if we have a look at the 3 GB file between the two of them, once again, across the whole, it does look like the XPG GAMMIX has just wiped the floor with the Titanium there on the right-hand side. The Titanium, a very, very good SSD, but given not only that the XPG GAMMIX is a lower price, but also it's a lower price and with higher benchmark there, it's very hard to describe that as anything more than a massive success, all the way through, of course, to the 5 gig test, where once again the GAMMIX ruled the day. So we come out of that there, and then finally go into AJA. Now AJA, once again, it's a lot harder to display, largely because with AJA it's not really designed for this kind of performance benchmark. So to put that into perspective, we need to look at the graphs at the bottom there. So as we can see, we were cracking into the late 5800s there, and again it is reversed on AJA because of the way it reads. So again, reverse read and write, but again, great performance benchmarks all the way through by this software, and no kind of obvious dips there as we've gone through all of the different reported minimums. And again, if we go back into the archive there about some of the other SSDs we've looked at, we can have a look perhaps at the Seagate Fire CUDA. With the Seagate Fire CUDA, it's very hard to make a direct comparison, because this, the testing we did for our review was a 500 gig SSD, and therefore comparing a 500 gig against a 1 TB is not really fair. Yes, the GAMMIX S70 is higher, but again, we're comparing against a 500 gigabyte drive when we're utilizing a 1 TB. So although it is higher, it's not really a fair comparison and not one that we can draw against. But I mean, again, the stats there that we have seen, and particularly, of course, the most obvious ones there, clearly indicate that this drive is an absolute beast. And again, although we do, we resist for the most part to make any direct and kind of formal comparison against the Seagate Fire CUDA from our previous review, giving it a 500 gig versus a 1 TB, I would still be keen to highlight, if we even remove write from the equation, that we can still see that this drive across each of the capacities, if we bring 16 versus 16 at the top, and we only look at read, we can see that the slight edge went to the ADATA GAMMIX S70 overall. And of course, write will ignore because of the capacity, and that was reflected in each of the capacities with 1 gigabyte test file there. Again, the GAMMIX outpacing that of the Fire CUDA quite significantly. Again, only focusing on read. Although it is worth highlighting, if we look at there on the second layer, we look at the IOPS, we can see a different story where, of course, the FireCuda has got reports of some of the highest IOPS available in any SSD at PCIe 4x0. Again, breaking into the 1 million comfortably. They do have some of the highest IOPS stats there, and of course the endurance that we talked about earlier on. But right now, given that the ADATA GAMMIX S70 is significantly more affordable than the likes of the FireCuda 530, I've got to say right now, I'm potentially looking at a new king here. And of course, you've got to factor in things like write and endurance in the grand scheme of things. And I think if you look at all the numbers side by side, the FireCuda probably wins on points. But in terms of affordability, in terms of read performance, in terms of value for money, and with a spectacular premiere there of the Integrit Rainer IG5236 here on the channel, I've got to dip my hat and tell XPG GAMMIX it is the score to beat if you look at things from a gamer's point of view. And I'll be really interested to see how direct comparison 1TB versus 1TB on the GAMMIX S70 versus the FireCuda 530, which hopefully I can get arranged and put together soon, how these two SSDs compare side by side in a more direct comparison. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I cannot wait to do the PS5 testing on this SSD to see what it's capable of. So do stay tuned for that. If you've enjoyed this video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe, because we've got lots more SSD reviews and benchmark testing to do. We'll also be doing PC loading benchmark comparisons very, very soon with all these SSDs that we've been featuring. And of course, if you are looking for the right data storage solution for you, be it NAS, be it DAS, be it for photo editing, gaming, or just simply to upgrade your PlayStation or console storage in general, use the free advice section. It's down there. It's linked to NAS Compares. It is completely free. There's donate buttons. You can ignore them if you like. We don't do anything with your email. It's manned by me, Eddie the Web Guy, two humans. It may take us a day extra or two to answer your emails, but we answer every single one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.